Edward Clark stopped breathing for a moment. His hand hovered over the doorknob. And his heart. It cracked before he even stepped inside. Because from the other side of the door, he heard his own daughter whisper, "Mark, once he signs the papers, Dad won't even know what hit him." Mark's voice followed, low and sharp. "Relax. The psychiatrist is already paid, and the sedatives will work tonight." Edward froze. The man who once prosecuted criminals now stood trembling in his own hallway, listening to the two people he loved most plan something deadly. Against him. He stepped back quietly. His chest tightened. His throat burned. Why are they doing this to me?" he whispered to himself. Inside, Lisa laughed cheerfully, as if she wasn't arranging the downfall of her own father. And, somewhere deep inside Edward, something awakened. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet, chilling resolve. He knew that one wrong move could destroy him. But staying silent? That would destroy everything he stood for. And that's where his story truly began. Before we dive deeper, if you're listening to this, I want to prove my mom wrong. She said I can't hit 3,000 subscribers, and my friends said I'm wasting my time. So please subscribe. Well, let's continue. Edward didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his dimly lit living room, the old ceiling fan humming slowly above him, the air thick with questions he never thought he'd ask about his own child. Lisa, his only daughter. The girl he once carried on his shoulders. The same girl who used to run to him after school, waving her drawings proudly. Now she was plotting to erase him from his own life. But Edward Clark was not a helpless man. He was retired, yes. Weary, yes. But he had spent 30 years as a prosecutor, chasing liars, dismantling schemes, sniffing out weak points in stories that didn't add up. And tonight, his instincts were loud again. He stared at his reflection on the dark TV screen. His voice was soft, calm, steady. Think like the lawyer you once were, not the father you wish you still had. He reached for his phone and called the only lawyer he still trusted, Dan Morris. Dan picked up on the second ring. "Edward? It's late. Everything okay?" "No," Edward whispered. "I need help, and I need it quietly." Within an hour, Dan was at his house, still in jeans and a hoodie, hair messy, breath smelling like leftover coffee. But his eyes sharpened when Edward explained everything. The whispers at the door, the sedatives, the bribed psychiatrist. Dan exhaled slowly. "This is serious. Elder fraud, conspiracy, abuse of guardianship laws. But with the right proof, we can bring them down." Proof. That word echoed in Edward's mind like a bell. He had spent his entire career teaching younger prosecutors that emotion didn't win cases. Evidence did. Dan pulled a small pouch from his backpack. "I brought these because you're not the only one dealing with family trouble lately." Inside were 3 voice-activated recorders, tiny enough to hide behind bookshelf ornaments or under sofa cushions. He handed them to Edward. "Place them where they talk the most. Living room, kitchen, bedroom hallway. Record everything for the next 48 hours. Edward nodded. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from heartbreak. Dan texted someone. Seconds later, he said, "Detective Diana Chen is awake. She wants to talk." Diana arrived just after midnight, wearing a plain jacket and a serious expression. She listened closely, then stood with her hands on her hips. "Mr. Clark, with your background, you already know the drill. Stay calm. Act normal. Let them think you're clueless. And if they try to drug you, do not consume it. Collect it. We'll test it." Her last instructions were simple, but heavy. "From now on, you are an undercover witness in your own home." Edward swallowed hard. A father shouldn't have to say this about his child, but he said it anyway. "I understand." Before leaving, Diana placed his address in a priority patrol list. In case anything happens, officers will reach you in minutes." The house felt different after they left. Quiet, tense, like a stage before the curtain rises. The next morning, Edward walked into the kitchen where Lisa and Mark were eating breakfast. He forced a smile, warm and shaky at the same time. "Good morning, kids." Lisa looked up, surprised. "Dad, you're awake early." He chuckled gently. "Couldn't sleep." "Oh, and I have news. Your uncle, he left me something in his will." Mark's eyes flickered. "What kind of something?" "A villa," Edward said calmly, "and 2 apartments." Lisa choked on her tea. Mark sat up straighter, trying to hide his excitement. "A, a villa?" Lisa repeated slowly, her voice soft and greedy. Edward nodded. "I was thinking, maybe I could transfer one of the apartments to you two. You know, help you start fresh." Lisa's face softened in the way it always did when she wanted something. "You're so good to us, Dad." But her eyes were calculating. What would you do if this happened to you? Trust your feelings? Or trust what you hear? As Edward turned his back to reach for a spoon, Lisa and Mark exchanged the kind of smile that wasn't meant for a father to see. Later, when they all left the kitchen, Edward quietly slid a recorder under the living room sofa, then another behind the vase next to the staircase. He walked slowly, carefully, pretending to be an aging man just cleaning up the house. But inside, every move was precise. Hours passed. Lisa entered the living room to make a phone call. The recorder clicked on silently. "Doctor, yes, we're still on schedule. My father will be ready tomorrow. You'll say he's mentally incompetent, right? Perfect. And don't worry, my husband is bringing the envelope." A few minutes later, Mark joined her. "Did he drink the tea?" he asked. Lisa sighed. "Not yet. I'll give it to him again at dinner." "Increase the dose." "Increase the dose." Those words were captured clearly, coldly. Edward heard none of it in real time. He was in his bedroom, pretending to nap. But later that night, when Lisa gave him a cup of tea that smelled strangely sweet, he lifted it to his lips, then pretended to cough, spilling a bit on the tray. "Oh, silly me," he said with a soft smile. "I'll save the rest for later." In the privacy of his room, he used a sterile container Dan gave him to gather the tea sample. He stored it in a zip bag. One more piece of evidence. Have you ever trusted someone so much that their betrayal felt unreal? Edward moved carefully, listening more, smiling more, pretending more. Every minute hurt, but every minute he collected proof. By midnight, he sat alone again, listening to the recorded playback, hearing Lisa's voice saying, "Once he's declared incompetent, everything becomes ours." Hearing Mark say, "After the papers are signed, we can sell the villa first." Hearing their laughter afterward, casual, familiar, heartless. A tear slid down Edward's cheek, silent and slow. He turned off the recorder, then whispered, "Tomorrow, it ends." Edward woke before sunrise, not because he was rested, but because fear had a way of waking a man early. The sky outside his window was still bluish-gray, the world quiet, heavy, waiting. He sat at the edge of his bed, rubbing his palms together like he used to do before walking into a courtroom. "Stay sharp," he whispered to himself. "Today is the day they push." Because Section 2, the day they tried to break him, had officially begun. Downstairs, he heard pans clattering in the kitchen. Lisa's voice floated through the air, too cheerful for morning. He could almost picture her forcing a smile as she stirred something, a smile she used to give him when she was little. But now it felt like a weapon. When he walked in, Lisa turned, carrying a mug. "Good morning, Dad." Her voice was bright. Fake bright. "I made your favorite breakfast. You need strength for today." Edward kept his face soft. He'd spent the night practicing this expression in the mirror, a mix of innocence and confusion. He took the mug. Thank you, sweetheart. Then he sniffed the tea lightly, just enough to confirm the same sweet smell as last night. He needed her to see him drink it, but he couldn't consume a drop, so he sipped just enough to wet his lips, then pretended the tea was hot, blowing on it, turning sideways, long enough to tilt it and let most of it drip into the sink while pretending to adjust his slippers. Lisa didn't notice. Mark was too busy talking on the phone. "All right, doctor," Mark whispered. "We're arriving at 11. Have the papers ready." Edward heard everything, but he acted like he heard nothing. "What papers?" he asked innocently, tilting his head. Mark froze for a split second, a micro-expression most people would miss, but not a former prosecutor. Just work stuff," Mark said quickly. "Company forms." "Boring stuff." Edward smiled gently. "Ah, I see. I hope your boss isn't too stressful." Lisa's shoulders relaxed. They thought he bought it. Inside, Edward felt the sting of their assumptions, the way they already saw him as fragile, unaware, drifty. But he needed that. He needed them confident, careless. What would you do if the people closest to you planned your downfall? Would you confront them, or gather the truth in silence? By mid-morning, Dan Morris texted, "Are they taking you to the psychiatrist today? Diana has units ready." Edward responded, "Yes, I'll keep pretending." He slid the phone into his pocket just as Lisa walked in. "Dad," she said softly, "you know we love you, right?" Edward nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." She came closer. "We've just been worried about you. You've been forgetful lately. You repeat things. It's okay. We want to help." Forgetful. Edward swallowed the ache building in his chest. So that's how she justified it in her mind, by rewriting who he was. "I appreciate it," he whispered. Lisa smiled, relieved. "Good, because today's appointment is important. The doctor will ask you simple questions. Just answer naturally." Edward kept his face neutral. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, basic things," Mark said. "Memory tests, logic, date and time, stuff like that." Edward nodded. "I hope I do okay." Mark placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You will, and even if you don't, we'll take care of you." The tenderness in his voice was worse than the betrayal. It felt like poison, coated in honey. By the time they got into the car, Edward already had a recorder hidden in the lining of his jacket, courtesy of Dan. He breathed slowly, staring out the window as the city passed by, pretending to be distracted while secretly capturing every word. Lisa leaned toward Mark. "After the doctor signs, we'll start the guardianship process immediately. We should list the villa first. The agent said it can go for almost $2 million. Mark chuckled. "With that money, we're gone from this neighborhood. Finally." Lisa sighed dreamily. "Dad won't miss it. He won't know anything." Edward blinked slowly, holding his breath so his voice wouldn't shake. This was the child he had put through college, the child he worked overtime for, the child he shielded from life's harshness so she could grow without pain. And yet, here she was. When they arrived at the psychiatrist's office, a quiet building tucked behind a law group, Edward felt a chill run up his spine. Inside, the waiting room was too clean, too empty, too quiet. The kind of office used for things people didn't want others to know about. The receptionist nodded the moment she saw Mark. "You can go right in. Dr. Morris is expecting you." Dr. Morris. The same last name as Dan, but no relation. The man greeted them with a smile too wide to be real. "Mr. Clark," he said, shaking Edward's hand a beat too long. "So good to meet you. Don't worry, this will be quick." His eyes flicked briefly at Mark. A cue. A signal. Edward pretended not to notice. The doctor closed the door behind them, picked up his clipboard, and began with soft, slow questions. "What day is it, Mr. Pribaniter Clark?" Edward answered clearly. "What month?" he answered. What's your daughter's name? He paused, deliberately, pretending to think. Lisa, he finally said. The doctor wrote something down with a smirk. Lisa exchanged a glance with Mark. The test continued. Each question was designed to fail him, not assess him. At one point, the doctor turned to Mark. Once the guardianship is approved, make sure he doesn't handle any finances. It's safer for everyone. Mark nodded. Of course, I'll take full control. And that moment, right there, sealed the deal. The recorder caught every word. Finally, the doctor said, Well, everything's ready. We can finalize the incompetency declaration as soon as I receive the envelope. Mark reached into his jacket, pulling out a thick, folded bundle of cash. Edward watched as the money changed hands. The doctor tucked it quickly into a drawer. That was when the office door burst open. Police! Nobody move! Detective Diana Chen stepped inside, followed by two uniformed officers. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. Lisa screamed. Mark jumped. The doctor froze, hand still hovering near the drawer. Edward sat still, breathing out slowly, finally free. Diana pointed at the psychiatrist first. Dr. Morris, you're under arrest for bribery, conspiracy to commit elder fraud, and falsifying medical evaluations. Then she turned to Mark and Lisa. And you two, step away from Mr. Clark. Lisa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Dad, please, this is a mistake. We were just trying to help. Edward closed his eyes. His heart felt heavy, bruised, but steady. Lisa, he whispered, you were trying to bury me alive. Her sobs filled the room. Officers cuffed them one by one, and as they were led away, Edward sat alone in the doctor's chair, hands trembling, breath shaking, but still, he held himself upright. Justice was served. But a father's heart was never built for this kind of victory. Edward remained seated long after the handcuffs clicked shut. The doctor's office, once too clean, too quiet, too perfect, now echoed with chaos. Papers on the floor. A chair knocked sideways, Lisa's sobs fading down the hall as officers escorted her away. But Edward didn't move. His breath came slowly, like each inhale had to pass through years of memories, birthdays, bedtime stories, Lisa laughing as a toddler in pink pajamas, Lisa graduating in her blue gown, Lisa crying on his shoulder after her first heartbreak. How does a father reconcile those memories with what he heard on the recordings? Detective Diana Chen stood quietly beside him, giving him the space he hadn't realized he needed. Mr. Clark, we're done here. You can stand, if you want. He nodded, but his legs felt like stone. When he finally stood, the room swayed slightly. Not from drugs, not from fear, from grief. Diana softened her voice. You did everything right. You were brave. Most people in your situation freeze or deny what's happening. Edward exhaled slowly. I wanted to believe she still loved me. Diana didn't respond. Some truths were too heavy for words. They walked outside together. The sunlight was blinding, almost rude, forcing itself onto a moment that felt so dark. Police cars lined the street. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Lisa and Mark were already in the back of separate cruisers. When Lisa saw Edward step out, she banged on the window with her cuffed hands. Dad! Dad! Please! You don't understand. We weren't going to hurt you. We just needed the money. Dad, please. Her voice cracked. It was real emotion, but the wrong kind. Desperation, not remorse. Edward turned away. If he looked at her too long, he knew his resolve would crumble. Inside his chest, something small and fragile twisted. A memory surfaced. Lisa, at age 9, running to him after a nightmare, saying, Daddy, don't ever leave me. Now she was the one who tried to take him away from himself. Detective Chen placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Come on. Dan is waiting for you at the station. They drove in silence. Midway through the ride, Diana spoke softly. Mr. Clark, what you did today probably saved your life. Edward stared out the window. Cars passed, people walked, life went on, unaware of the storm inside him. What would you do, he murmured, if your own child betrayed you like this? Diana didn't answer. Some questions weren't meant to be solved, only carried. At the station, Dan greeted him with open arms. You okay? He asked. Edward swallowed the lump in his throat. I don't know. Dan guided him into a quiet conference room. Stacks of paperwork, evidence bags, and 2 sealed containers, one holding the drugged tea sample, the other a USB drive with the recordings. Dan tapped the drive. This is airtight. They won't wriggle out of this. Edward sat down, rubbing his temples. His voice dropped to a fragile whisper. I didn't raise her to be like this. Dan sighed, pulling out a chair. Life twists people. Money twists people. Pressure. The wrong partner. You never really know what's brewing in someone's heart. Edward stared at the evidence table. Everything laid out so neatly. Cold. Precise. Final. Can I hear some of it? He asked. Dan hesitated, but nodded. He pressed play. Lisa's voice filled the room. Once he's declared incompetent, I want the villa first. Dad won't even realize it's gone. Edward closed his eyes. Every sentence felt like a cut. Mark's voice followed. Relax. He's old. He trusts us. This will be easy. Pause. Click. End of recording. Edward wiped his face quickly, not wanting to cry in front of anyone, even his closest friend. Dan leaned forward. Hey, this doesn't mean you failed as a father. Edward shook his head. It feels like it. No, Dan said firmly. It means you loved her so deeply. You never imagined she could do this. That's not failure. That's trust. And they abused it. Silence hung heavy. Hours passed as Edward answered questions, signed statements, and handed over every piece of evidence he had gathered with trembling hands. Eventually, the weight began to settle. Not disappear, but settle. By evening, Detective Chen returned with an update. They're being charged formally tonight. And, Mr. Clark, the judge already granted a protective order for your assets. Nothing can be touched. Edward nodded slowly. Thank you. Outside, the sky had turned golden orange. A calm evening. Strange, considering the day he'd endured. As Diana walked him to the exit, she whispered, You're stronger than you know. Edward smiled faintly, tired but grateful. When he stepped outside, the cool evening breeze touched his face gently, almost like a blessing. He closed his eyes. Betrayal had shattered him today. But truth had carried him. Justice had protected him. And somewhere deep inside, a small seed of peace settled. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. Enough to breathe again, enough to walk forward. He whispered to himself, I'm still standing. For the first time in a long while, it felt true. Edward didn't go home that night. Dan insisted he stay at a small guest apartment above his law office, quiet, clean, and far from the emotional wreckage waiting for him at his own house. Edward agreed, not because he feared for his safety anymore, but because the silence he needed simply didn't exist in the place where his daughter once laughed. He sat on the edge of the guest bed, staring at a small lamp casting warm light across the room. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lisa's face behind the police car window, crying, reaching, begging. He asked himself again and again, where did I go wrong? How did we get here? Was there a moment I didn't notice her slipping away? But guilt is a dangerous storyteller. It rewrites the past in cruel ways, and Edward had spent enough years in courtrooms to know the truth. Everyone makes their own choices, even the people you love. He finally lay down around midnight, but sleep only lasted a few hours. By dawn, he sat awake again, hands wrapped around a cup of plain black coffee, staring out the window as the city stretched itself awake. At 7:13 a.m., his phone buzzed. Unknown number. But Edward recognized the area code, the county jail. He let it ring once, twice, a third time. Then he answered. A shaky breath came through the line. "Dad? It's me, Lisa." Edward closed his eyes. He didn't speak. Not yet. Lisa sniffled. "Dad, I'm sorry. Please, please don't let them keep me here. I didn't mean for things to go this far." He leaned back, feeling his heartbeat steady itself. "Lisa," he said quietly, "you planned to take everything from me. My house, my future, my mind." "No, Dad, it wasn't like that," she sobbed. "I was desperate. We were drowning in debt. Mark said—" "Mark said?" Edward interrupted, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "You and Mark sat in my home and planned to drug me, to declare me incompetent, to sell everything I worked for. That wasn't desperation, Lisa. That was cruelty." Silence. Painful. Long. Then her voice cracked into a whisper. "I didn't think you'd find out." That sentence, it shattered whatever was left of Edward's hope. He inhaled deeply. "Lisa, I loved you more than anything. But love doesn't excuse what you did." Her breath hitched. "So you're letting them destroy my life?" Edward's eyes welled, not with weakness, but with the heaviness of truth. "You destroyed your own life," he whispered. "I just survived it." The line went quiet. Then it disconnected. Edward sat still for several minutes afterward, letting the ache wash over him like a tide he had no strength to fight. A soft knock came at the door. Dan peeked in. "Hey," he said gently. "You up?" Edward forced a small smile. "Barely." Dan walked in with a bag of breakfast sandwiches. "I figured you wouldn't eat unless someone forced you." Edward chuckled weakly. Still the same old Dan. They ate in silence for a moment until Dan finally said, "You know, justice doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like grief." Edward nodded. "That's exactly what it feels like." A few hours later, Detective Chen requested he meet her at the station for one last review of his testimony. Edward agreed. When he arrived, Diana greeted him with her usual steady presence. Warm eyes, firm posture, voice gentle but strong. "Mr. Clark," she said, shaking his hand, "I want you to know something important before we continue." He looked at her, tired but attentive. "You didn't turn in your daughter. You turned in a criminal conspiracy. There's a difference." Edward swallowed. "I know, but she's still my daughter." Diana nodded slowly. "And you're still her father. That hasn't changed. But now, she has to face the consequences of her choices." They went through the final paperwork, clean, precise, professional. Edward answered every question, signed every form, provided every detail with the quiet composure of a man who had spent his life defending truth. As he prepared to leave, Diana walked him to the door. "Mr. Clark," she said softly, "what will you do now?" Edward gazed at the parking lot, the world moving normally around him, unaware of the storm that had changed everything. "I'll go home," he said, "and start living again. On my own terms." Diana smiled. "You deserve that." When Edward finally returned to his house that evening, the silence felt different from before. Not threatening, not heavy, just empty. He walked through the hallway slowly, each step a reminder of how fragile trust could be. He paused in the living room, where his daughter had once played as a child, where her laughter used to fill the house, where she and Mark had planned his downfall just days before. He whispered to the air, I forgive you, but I won't forget." Then he stepped outside to the porch, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops. A quiet peace settled in. Not happiness, not yet, but hope. Small, gentle, alive. You see, every storm leaves room for rebuilding. Every betrayal leaves space for wisdom. And every heartbreak leaves a chance for healing. Edward didn't win back his daughter, but he won back himself, his freedom, his dignity, his life. And sometimes, that's the miracle you didn't know you needed. Moral of the story. In the quiet that followed the storm, Edward learned one of life's hardest truths. Love requires trust, but trust must be guarded. Even those closest to us can fall into darkness when driven by greed or desperation. Yet forgiveness, even silent forgiveness, frees the heart more than revenge ever could. And though Edward's world cracked, it didn't crumble. He stood again, stronger, wiser, anchored by faith and resilience. If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button for more emotional tales from King's Folklore. And even if it didn't, come on, subscribe anyway. We'll win you over next time. Drop a comment, like the video, and let's keep the stories alive. Thanks for watching.